Thank you. Well, first of all, I would also, like my colleagues before me, like to thank the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and the Nikos Boulantzas Institute and Transform Europe for this invitation and providing the opportunity to participate with such distinguished colleagues and comrades and learn about the struggles in Greece and other parts of Europe. The issue with going last is that a lot of what I will say you have already heard, so I apologize for any redundancies, but I think it is also interesting that there is substantial coincidences in the experiences of the countries that have been talked about up till now and the country that I will talk about, which is Argentina. Argentina's experience with debt crises and default and debt restructuring are well known, I think, at this point, and there has been much debate about the possible relevance of Argentina's example to European countries and particularly Greece, Ireland, and the countries that are highly indebted today. However, the relevance of Argentina's experience doesn't end with the debt crisis. Argentina's poor economic performance since 2009, roughly, I think also has lessons that are perhaps even more relevant for the left in power. And so I will focus slightly more on that today than on the debt. My comments will be divided into three parts. First, I will give a brief background of neoliberalism in Argentina, and of course the result of that, which was the spectacular default of December 2001, the debt buildup and the default. The second part will focus on the profound structural transformations that occurred under neoliberalism. 25 years of neoliberalism in Argentina, and what has been done, or what has not been done rather, to address this by the political power. I will try to draw from that some possible lessons for the left in power. Argentina's neoliberal transformation began in 1976 with the bloodiest dictatorship in our country's history. Since then, we have experienced 25 years of neoliberal economic policies, with the most intense neoliberal period being 1991 to 2001. Many of the policies described by my colleagues before me were implemented in Argentina. Widespread privatizations, labor, sort of persecution of labor and precariousness of the employment relation, or the deepening of the precariousness in the employment relation, were central to all of this. But perhaps the most widely publicized effect of neoliberalism was, of course, the cycles of debt and the unsustainable debt buildup that Argentina experienced, and of which we had a couple cycles that included unsustainable buildup, debt crisis, default, IMF intervention before the crisis, and then, of course, back to debt buildup again. December of 2001 saw the largest sovereign default, at least to date, in history, performed by Argentina. After this default, Argentina also abandoned its fixed exchange rate currency arrangement, so recovering, stopping payments on the debt and recovering sovereignty over our currency enabled Argentina to emerge from this 4-year recession, a depression really, and to get a fresh start in a way. The default and the recovery of our currency was followed by 7 years of unprecedented growth for Argentina. We were growing at 7, 8, 9% levels on a sustained basis. And there was a substantial improvement in the social indicators, lowering of unemployment, lowering of poverty rates, lowering of hunger, and slight improvements in inequality, though not as dramatic as one would have expected given the growth rates. However, since 2007, economic problems began to emerge. A lot of this has been in the mainstream press recently. Most of you have probably seen the Economist's story on Argentina, and if not, it's worth reading as an incredible piece of neoliberal economic and political propaganda. However, there are real problems in Argentina today. What are the manifestation of these problems? Inflation began to creep up in 2007 and has been at a sustained rate of about 20 to 25% yearly since then, which is an issue. Capital flight, as a result, picked up pace, depleting the central bank's international reserves. Social unrest over the erosion of the salary or wages purchasing power has also increased. And the usual suspects of prior eras, the powerful economic players, have also been making their moves, increasing prices while putting caps on salary increases. So there's a very clear distributional struggle going on there. What has been the government's response to this? Well, to be honest, it's been rather disappointing. Initially, denial of the inflation situation by altering the official statistics. So while statistics, the National Official Statistics Agency has been reporting roughly 10% inflation for the last years, when most private and other provincial indicators say that it's at least 2.5 times that. Price controls to try to keep at least foodstuff from price increases have mostly failed. They may have worked for very short periods of time, but as the inflation rate indicates, were not successful in the medium term. And even more distressing, perhaps, is that after 7 years of this situation, the government has decided to implement a fairly orthodox adjustment program. So now we have monetary contraction, a very sort of hike in the interest rates, fiscal spending cuts, elimination of subsidies to energy, which means that most households will end up paying a lot more. Ironically, the minister currently implementing many of these policies is a minister that was known in academia for teaching Marxist economics. And so we have a government with one-time Marxist economists who still thinks or claims to be a progressive or heterodox economist implementing a very orthodox IMF-style adjustment package. And additionally, the country is seeking again to regularize its situation with the international financial markets by negotiating with the Paris Club, and trying to get back out on financial markets to be able to take on new debt. So why is this happening? Why is the return to austerity in a way after a period of such successful growth, and after having claimed, and I think rightly so, that default and recovering currency sovereignty were key to this performance? Well, or perhaps to put it differently, why a return to the past, to the status quo ante the default? The first thing to say is that this is not related to the default or to having recovered our currency. This is not a direct consequence of that, as many of the neoliberal media stories are claiming. Interestingly, in Argentina, there is not one neoliberal economist or commentator or journalist that makes this link. So it's kind of disconcerting why the international neoliberal journalists are claiming this and don't consult with their Argentine colleagues who would, at least on this, be able to set them straight. The answer to this return to the past may be simplistic, may be disappointing, but I think it's at the heart of what's going on today. And it is that between 1976 and 2001, Argentina underwent a very profound social, political, and economic transformation based on neoliberal framework and guidelines. Undoing such a profound transformation and restructuring does not happen overnight, does not happen automatically, and it does not happen because one adopts a fiery rhetoric against the IMF, for example, as Kirchner, the president in 2003 did. It requires deliberate political action, which unfortunately Argentina, for the most part, has not taken. In other words, default and recovering the currency were necessary but not sufficient to undo the legacy of 25 years of neoliberalism. So what were some of these transformations that occurred during these 25 years between 76 and 2001 in Argentina? They are similar to some of the things that were mentioned before, but this is also what I think European countries have to look forward to if they continue down this path of radical neoliberalism. I will only enumerate what some of these effects were, as time is short, and the effects were also very extensive. Deindustrialization and a reprimarization of the economy were key. Argentina, by 1975, because of the import substitution industrialization policies, was a sort of moderately industrialized country and had very high levels of industrialization by Latin American standards. As a result of neoliberalism, there has been a sustained deindustrialization and reprimarization of the economy. In other words, a renewal of dependence on primary sector exports. With the additive that primary exports are now highly transgenic, intensive in agrochemical use, and also there has been a deliberate policy by the government to invite extractive, highly contaminating and destructive extractive industries. Mining, Barrick Gold is big in Argentina, and other European mining companies as well. Strong economic concentration and increasing monopoly power. There has been a very strong concentration of the economy in a few hands, and this is clearly a hallmark of the neoliberal era. This trend has also continued in the post-default period. Strong foreign ownership of the economy, the increase of foreign investment, buying up formerly Argentine businesses, has increased radically during the neoliberal era, especially during the 90s, but has also continued since the default. This, of course, has many problems. One is the lack of local control over productive investment. The other is the siphoning off of profits to the headquarters abroad. Financialization of the banking system and of the capital markets. This is another hallmark of neoliberalism. You have seen it across Europe, and Argentina was no exception to this. Interestingly, the profits of the banking system since the default have been at record levels, levels of magnitude higher even than in the 90s. So we can see that the banking system has benefited very nicely even after the default and the devaluation. Of course, privatization of, transformation of the state is another key element which was also mentioned before. Destruction of many of the state's planning capacities and its capacity to intervene in the economy was a sustained impact or effect of the neoliberal policies in the 25 years. Part of this was the privatization of key services that used to be provided by the states, and this is not unlike the Greek case. Utilities, transportation, even airports, the mail system, I mean, you name it, it's being privatized. The oil company, which was, of course, highly profitable and is now partially recovered by the Argentine state after having been depleted by the previous private owners. Indiscriminate use of foreign debt for short-term macroeconomic imbalances. This was, of course, one of the reasons behind the debt buildup. Interestingly, the debt crisis in Argentina and the default were the direct consequence of the privatization of the social security system, which is also being promoted, as I hear over here. A highly regressive tax structure. This is also not new and also a consequence, a direct goal of the neoliberal policies. Decentralization of health and education to the provincial and local jurisdictions. One may think that having local control over this is a positive step, but the problem is that the funding was also decentralized. So what we have now is a highly unequal educational and healthcare system where jurisdictions with larger budgets are able to finance this, and the poorer provinces have highly deficient services. Labor market deregulation and the weakening of labor's organizations is also clearly one of the objectives of the neoliberal onslaught. The so-called labor flexibilization or deregulation of the labor markets to be able to give more power to the capital. Structural social exclusion is also a consequence of the neoliberal era, and record levels of inequality. Inequality in Argentina was the highest in 2001 after 25 years of neoliberalism. And we had the best income distribution of our history in 1975. So there's a very clear decline in the participation of labor in national income throughout the entire period. And also less economically so perhaps, but I think equally important is the ideological legacy. Social atomization, individualism, consumerism, a loss of the sense that we solve problems collectively, that if we are not all better off, then nobody wins. And a transformation of this blame the victim approach, which characterizes a lot of the World Bank's programs, targeted, focalized programs. And an additional ideological legacy is focusing, which this was also mentioned before, interestingly, focusing on economic problems as belonging to the country exclusively and not to the way the capitalists in Argentina interact with the world capitalism and how Argentina's insertion into the world system works and how global capitalism works. So this extreme focus on the individual country and everything has to be fixed in there. So given, neoliberalism's impact in Argentina, and all of this I was describing sounds general, but all of this is what happened in Argentina, is not unlike the results of scorched earth policies applied in earlier decades in Vietnam and Central America by US foreign policies. The social and economic panorama is a desolate one. So how does one go about undoing this legacy? And this is a hugely complex task, as you all can imagine, and it requires a very substantial effort by the left that is trying to reverse it. And if this very substantial effort is not undertaken, then what ends up happening is that any progressive force that gets into power ends up being the administrator of the scorched earth left behind by neoliberalism. And that is an impossible task. You will end up implementing austerity and adjustment policies like the current administration in Argentina is doing. So if we want to learn from Argentina's example, I think that we can draw some lessons here of what should be done that we have unfortunately not yet done. So the first thing to understand is that this does not happen automatically because we have a different political inclination or because our discourse is different. We need another long-term transformation of the economy, of society, and of politics in a very different direction from that of the previous decades in the Argentine case. And we also need to be careful not to not to want to return to the status quo ante necessarily. There is a lot of very nostalgic discourse in Argentina about industrialization and the sort of first Peronist era, which is no more than discourse, but that is not necessarily where we should be aiming today at any rate. So what do we need to do in order to achieve this in very broad guidelines? First of all, we need to rebuild a state. Now the question is, what kind of state do we need to rebuild? Clearly, the neoliberal state is a minimalist state aimed at guaranteeing financial sector profits. Mostly, we need a different state from that. So we need a state that is able to lead, to design and to lead in the implementation of long-term structural change. We need a state that is able to intervene in the economy and to plan, and a state that is able to decentralize and increase popular participation in these processes. We need national banks. The nationalization of the banking system is not a bad idea, especially if banks have been bailed out. They are already partly public. And if not, create public banks, as we have heard before from the Icelandic case and others. In today's financialized banking system and in the international banking system, and this is certainly the case in Argentina, banks are not, the business of banks is not to invest in long-term productive investment. And that is what we need for development. So if the private banking system is not going to do it, either we nationalize it or we create public banks that will do it and let the private banks speculate with the money of those who want to risk it. But the savings and the funds for investment and for development should be channeled through national banks. Also, we need to think once again about industrial policy, about technology policy, about where we want the economy to go to. The market very clearly is not able to decide that, or if we leave it to the market, we will end up where Argentina is. We need to have a clear idea of what direction we need to go in. And part of this discussion is, how do we want to participate in the world economy? Are we going to be simply a provider of primary goods? Are we going to be a provider of cheap labor, as most of the periphery still today, despite all the talk of global value chains, this has not altered the fact that peripheral countries in Latin America, Africa, the periphery of Europe, participate through cheap labor as one of their main exportable goods, as it were. Also, with the awareness that we today have, we need to be very careful about the environmental issues and environmental sustainability. And not end up mortgaging future generations based on our current strategy. Also, the opportunity should be taken to promote cooperative and other forms of collective ownership of the means of production. If we're going to go in a different direction, then this clearly has to be at the center of it. In Argentina, we have, as a result of the crisis, small but vibrant worker-run enterprise, worker-run factory movement. There are about 200 of them still today. Unfortunately, the government has had no sort of overall policy towards this sector. So clearly, legislation, credit, facilitating the operation of these businesses, worker-run businesses, should be, I think, a key part. A profound tax reform. Okay, thank you. A profound tax reform is also necessary. We spoke of a highly regressive tax system. Argentina's tax system today is still highly regressive. We have a 21% sales tax, which it makes up about a third or more of government revenue. And this is paid, as we all know, primarily by those with, or disproportionately by those with lower incomes. And one of the issues with a progressive tax policy is that we also need to deal here with the very insidious legacy of neoliberalism and this individualism of what I make is mine and why should the state appropriate that, and also this trickle-down ideology that we don't tax the rich because they will supposedly invest in the economy and this will produce improvements in welfare for all. So we need to rebuild a solidarity-based conception of public spending and of taxation, and that our taxes contribute to the public good. These are just some of the issues that I wanted to mention as what is necessary to overcome this legacy of neoliberalism, and there are issues which in Argentina, unfortunately, we have not undertaken, but which I think we will need to undertake if we are not going to return to the previous cycles of debt, crises, and all the other stuff that I mentioned. Thank you very much for your attention.